Good evening, friends, and welcome to Spiritual Story Time. Before we begin, Gesar of Ling, I wanted to share something with you. I don't know if you've noticed that during my storytelling times that I have been wearing different fancy jackets. And tonight I'm wearing a silk jacket that I got 18 years ago, and this is the very first time that I've worn it. So what do you think? Nice, huh? Anyway, I love this jacket, and it's been in the back of my closet because I always wear very plain clothes. And so during this time when I'm not exactly in my official capacity as a spiritual mentor, that I've taken this opportunity to drag out some of these. And they are correct, but a little bit fancier than usual, and to kind of enjoy wearing some of these silky kinds of jackets that I don't normally wear, and especially in the garden or cooking. Huh? So I had an idea. I bet, like me, you have things hanging in the back of your closet that have been too pretty to wear, or you just never got around to it, or it was never really appropriate for what you wanted to wear it for. So why don't you just wear it? Why don't you wear it to, I don't know, cook, or for dinner? Come to dinner with a nice, whatever it is, I don't know, maybe a new pair of pajamas that you never wore. Anyway, I'm enjoying wearing these lovely things that have been in the back of the closet, and if I didn't wear them soon, I would definitely have to give them away. So I would like to keep them, so I'm wearing them. So tonight is one of the great stories, probably the great story of Tibet, which is Gesar of Ling. And this afternoon, I put a link to Wikipedia so that people could take a peek at the story behind Gesar of Ling and the genesis of it in Tibet, etc. And actually, it's in quite a few countries, but we always think Gesar of Ling belongs to Tibetans. So tonight we're going to be reading about his exploits. So this is like a rough and tumble adventure story, but it's also a little bit about Buddhism. So here we go. This is from our book, this Tibetan Fairy Tales. No, Tibetan Folk Tales, not fairy tales, folk tales. So this is our book, and it's by Frederick and Audrey Hyde Chambers, if you ever wanted to look for a copy. And there's a number of stories, and a lot more stories after we finish this. So we'll begin Gesar of Ling tonight. For more than 1,000 years, the people of Tibet have sung of the warrior king, Gesar of Ling. With the passing of the centuries, the epic has grown so that a bard singing the story today will take up to 6 hours a day for several weeks to complete the entire epic. There are many episodes in the story, and it is not unusual for different bards to develop their own sequence of episodes. The story that follows tells of Gesar's birth and how he became king of Ling. The essential storyline remains the same in all the telling of the epic, but their settings and expression vary. Our story is drawn from a series of frescoes in Samdu Monastery in Kham, the eastern province of Tibet, where Kusho Rala was a monk. Although there are a few manuscript copies of the epic, it is essentially part of Tibet's oral tradition, memorized and handed down generation after generation. Gesar, the warrior king of Ling, is to Tibet what St. George is to England, the national hero, the conqueror of evil, But perhaps Gesar is a little more, for he is the just king, the protector of the poor, the defender of Buddha's teachings. There seems to be little doubt that Gesar is a historical figure, and indeed, until the recent changes brought about in Tibet by the Chinese occupation, there was a king of Ling who was recognized as his descendant. But the warrior king has also grown in stature with the passing of the centuries. The Manchu emperors, for example, worshipped him as a god of war. And many see in Gesar echoes of Caesar. News of the Roman conqueror traveled to Tibet with merchants on the Silk Roads. To the Tibetans, Gesar still lives. And in addition to the story, and the additions to the story are the natural consequences of his revealing more of his life. Although the story is meant to be entertaining, it is also regarded as having a deeper significance. And anyone telling the epic would at the very least believe himself inspired by Gesar. Bards go into trances while relating his life and are believed to be in direct communication with the warrior king. To ordinary people, Gesar is such a living reality that when they travel, they will sing whatever snatches they know of the story as invocations for protection on their journey. Gesar's world of fantasy and magic is no less real to the Tibetans than the world in which we live, for they regard both as images in a dream. They say that the fantastic events in the epic result from Gesar's harmony with and knowledge of the forces of the universe, so that he could influence and use them in much the same way Western scientists now employ nuclear energy and laser light. The Epic of Gesar has become the national story of Tibet, but to the people of the land of snow, it is not just past history. It contains many prophecies of Gesar's return to Tibet. So the epic is also a guarantee to Tibetans that once again their land will know the rule of a just king in a free realm. It is said that many centuries ago, the kingdom of Ling, famous for its piety and the wisdom of its sages, was to suffer a time of great unhappiness. Darkness, the shadow of revenge, was to fall over the people, and the light of the Dharma would be extinguished. Such a night, never to be relieved by the dawn, was to come about because of a woman who thought her unhappy life was a result of the Buddha's curse. Vengeance and hatred filled her heart, so that her dying wish was to be reborn with her 3 sons as rulers in the Buddhist kingdoms, and so be able to take vengeance on the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings. Padmasambhava, the lotus-born, also known as Guru Rinpoche, or the Precious Master, realized the intensity of the demonic power that would be unleashed by the dying woman's wish, and sought to save the 3 kingdoms in East Tibet, where she and her 3 sons would be reborn. At Guru Rinpoche's request, the Bodhisattva Tupagawa agreed to incarnate among the men of the kingdom of Ling and to fight the dark powers which would rule the kingdom and its principalities. Guru Rinpoche chose as the mother of the incarnate Bodhisattva a young Naga, one of the serpent spirits of the water. Nagas can easily transform themselves, and so the spirit had no difficulty in assuming the form of a young and very beautiful girl who came to be known as Gongmo. The girl walked many miles through the kingdom of Ling, accompanied by a mare, a cow, a ewe, a she-goat, and a bitch. As Gongmo approached the capital of Ling, she saw that there were crowds of people around the great gate to the city. They were obviously waiting for someone. Gongmo's arrival in the city caused much laughter, for everyone knew that Tondo, the steward of the kingdom, had seen many omens indicating the arrival of a great being who would change the history of Ling. For this, the townspeople had been waiting at the city gate. But to their delight, only a beggar girl and her few animals came to Ling that day. Even so, Tondun did not let his hurt pride sway his belief in the omens. He decided to learn more about the beggar girl, and so arranged for her to be taken into the service of his sister, the Queen of Ling. It was not long before Gongmo became a familiar figure in the community, and frequently the subject of the local men's talk and attentions, for she had unusual beauty. Her perfectly formed body and the compelling luster of her eyes were combined with a grace and charm of manner that was even more attractive because of its innocence. Her qualities would have marked her out anywhere, but they were certainly unusual in a herdswoman. And it was not long before the queen, enjoying Gongmo's company, arranged for her to work much of the time in the household. Gongmo was now often with the queen, who foolishly did not foresee that her husband, King Sining, would also awaken to Gongmo's attractions. After a time, they had fallen deeply in love, so that the king was determined to take Gongmo as his second wife. The queen was furious both at the king's evident love for Gongmo and at the popularity among the people of the king's proposal. She did everything in her power to dissuade the king and refused to agree to his taking Gongmo as his second wife. But the queen knew that this would not deter him, and that there was only one way to make certain that she alone was the king's wife and the Queen of Ling. The queen arranged for Gongmo to take the yak herd to new pastures. Gongmo's suspicions were aroused since she could not see any reason for the change, and she remembered hearing vague stories about the area to which she was being sent. At the false dawn, Gongmo stirred the yaks into activity with calls and pebbles from her slingshot on their insensitive rumps. Anxiously, the queen watched from an upper window as Gongmo urged on the great ambling yaks, bellowing at being disturbed. To reassure herself, Gongmo spun a prayer wheel as she walked, murmuring its mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. The physical activity helped to focus and concentrate her thoughts. The way to the pasture land passed through a narrow ravine. Gongmo felt increasingly nervous at the reactions of the yaks, who bellowed furiously and stubbornly refused all coaxing and threats to get them to continue. Very slowly, she managed to move them on. But when they were far into the ravine, she realized that there was no sound except the growing protests of the yaks. No bird calls, no rustle of breezes in this stunted grass, no movement or sound from any insect. Nothing. Complete silence. Gongmo began to feel very frightened, too frightened even to turn the prayer wheel, as she began to think that this valley must be the one in the stories, the valley of the silent ones. It was said that strange and evil beings were trapped in the valley because it was the only place without sound. That there they found relief and sanctuary from the agony they suffered at even the slightest noise. As Gongmo remembered the stories, she stopped walking and looked about her with dread, even afraid to breathe. Her rapid heartbeat filling her ears so that it sounded like a thunder in the valley. The yaks snorted and stamped the ground as they clustered together. Gongmo could feel their apprehension. She remembered hearing that anyone who ventured into the valley of the silent ones and made the slightest sound caused the silent ones so much pain that in their desperate anger they slew the intruder without mercy. Gongmo turned suddenly, feeling herself being watched, but there was no sign of anyone or anything in the bleak, treeless valley with its contorted rocks and boulders. Yet her feeling grew into an appalling certainty as she became aware of not just the presence of someone or something, as she became aware of not just the presence of someone or something intently watching her, but of numerous presences circling closer, unseen, silent, stifling. She gave a frightened, unbelieving cry and tried to run from the invisible ring, but it made no difference. In desperation, she called on Guru Rinpoche as she felt herself being invaded by the invisible forces and in her mind's eye glimpsed their awful forms. As she cast about for some way to escape the entities that were suffocating her mind, her very life force, the ravine was transfused with light and became transparent as she sank into despair to the ground. Her vision was clouded by the light as she weakly murmured appeals to Guru Rinpoche. The light grew brighter as Gongmo's weakening eyes searched, hungered for release. Everything was fading from sight. The sky, the ravine, the earth, in the iridescent gold light, which became a thick mist that enveloped her. Now Gongmo was sure she was dead and in the Bardo realm. Dimly, Gongmo realized she was free of the oppressive forces that had stifled her, but it took a few moments for her mind to adjust. Her fear only slowly dispelled in the soothing light. The mist thinned to reveal a beautiful rainbow arching up into the heavens. Around the rainbow, the golden light grew more intense, thickened, and solidified, taking shape so that within moments the figure of the great deity Kenzo appeared. His body was like a living image of gold, and as he slowly descended the rainbow, Gongmo saw that he held a holy water vase with a peacock feather sprinkler fanned from its top. In a voice like thunder from heaven, Kenzo said to her, "Guru Rinpoche heard your call, so I have come." He bent toward her, holding out the vase. The water within this vase has held the reflection of Bodhisattva Tupten-gawa, who is to incarnate among the men of Ling. Drink this water, and in due course you shall bear the incarnation of Tupten-gawa, he who will be Dharma warrior, the king of Ling. The queen was horrified when she came across Gongmo churning cream in the kitchen. and realized that the girl had escaped from the Valley of the Silent Ones. The two women looked at each other, and the queen had no doubt that Gongmo understood the terrible trap into which she had been sent. But Gongmo said nothing, even to the king. The months passed, and Gongmo, feeling no sign of pregnancy, began to wonder if indeed she would be giving birth to the incarnation of Tupagawa. But one day she was sitting on the flat roof of the house. The remarkable golden light that had heralded the approach of Kenso appeared again. And again a beautiful rainbow formed, stretching across the sky and leading straight to the house. From all parts of town, people came running to the king's house to see the signs in the sky that could only mean the coming of a great being. Within the house, there was a considerable amount of confusion. No one knew why the king's house should be so honored. In the uproar, Gongmo slipped down the stairs to her room and carefully closed the door behind her. The crowds outside were both frightened and fascinated as dancing lights that suddenly appeared around the house. Few people noticed that Gongmo's cow, ewe, she-goat, and bitch all gave birth at this time, as did her mare, to a superb foal with a silvery coat, a blue horse, a horse of the gods. Gongmo waited, nervous and uncertain. She had a very strong feeling that the rainbow and the dancing lights heralded her child's entry into the world. But she thought, looking dubiously at her belly, such an evident lack of any sign of pregnancy did make her wonder if she was not deceiving herself. Just occasionally during the months, she had vaguely felt an awareness of another life within her, but it was so fleeting she could not be sure. "Oh, mother!" A voice, to Gongmo's amazement, came from her stomach. "Now is the time for my birth. Be not afraid. Turn your mind to Guru Rinpoche." This was indeed no ordinary child, she thought, settling herself on the divan and feeling rather shaken that her as yet unborn child could already talk. The golden light gradually filled the room. She felt it penetrating every fiber of her being. As she meditated, she unconsciously lifted her hands to her head to receive an emerging sphere of glowing light. We must prepare for the great Lama. The king was standing on the flat roof of his house with his queen. Both looked with awe at the light flooding from the rainbow and could feel its energy. The queen murmured, "Perhaps we are to be honored for what is, and not for what will be." The king looked at his wife sharply. "Explain, what have you heard?" The queen smiled at him and rested her hand soothingly on his arm. "Nothing. I heard nothing, husband. But I just say what could be." As she turned to go, the king gestured for her to stay with him. He knew that she was not telling him all of her suspicions. "I'm going to have the house searched," the queen explained. "There has to be a reason for," she gestured to the rainbow, "this." The king looked down at the crowd around the house. Many of them were chanting prayers. Gongmo held the globe to her breast and felt the tiny heartbeat within. Smiling, she felt the globe move and stretch in her hands, and the baby struggling to release himself. Her baby. Gongmo was filled with a sense of wonder and love as the tiny babe struggled into the world, breaking free from his eggshell of light. Gongmo was far more conscious of the miracle of the baby himself than the manner of his birth. After cleaning him, she nursed him, singing a lullaby as she cradled him in her arms. The door of Gongmo's room flew open, and the queen just caught a glimpse of the child enveloped in golden light as the girl hid the baby in the folds of her dress. Within seconds, the celestial light evaporated. Gongmo looked at the queen with a mixture of fear for her child and an aggressive determination to protect him. The queen was not really surprised. Somehow she had known. Slowly she entered the room as Gongmo watched her with dread, realizing there is no worse enemy than a former friend, and even greater enmity when the field of battle is a husband. "My lady, please!" Gongmo's restraining hand was like a feather as the queen pulled back the folds of the girl's dress. Both women gasped in amazement. In a matter of moments, the infant had grown to the size of a year-old child. He fixed the queen with dark, compelling eyes. The queen backed slowly away, longing to flee the intense gaze. In the courtyard of the house, the queen looked drawn and anxious as she spoke to the servant, who was soothing his restive horse. You have mentioned the message?" "Yes, Highness." "Then take it swiftly to my brother, the steward Tondon." She turned away, muttering, "May he have the answer to this curse upon our lives." Angrily, she spun the prayer wheel set in niches in the wall. Tondon, the steward of Ling, was discussing his revenues with his chamberlain when he received the queen's messenger and news of Gongmo's strange confinement. Agitatedly, Tondon ran his hand over his close-cropped hair. His chamberlain could not help thinking that his master looked just like a worried rabbit, with his buck teeth emphasized by his thick mustache, curling around his mouth and out across his cheeks. "It is happening! It is happening!" Tondon wailed. "As prophesied, it is happening!" At first, neither Tondon's wife nor his chamberlain could understand him. Then he reminded them of the ancient prophecy. "It tells," Tondon said, "of a young girl who will arrive in Ling with 5 animals, just like Gongmo, and who will give birth to a magic child who will become a great and victorious king of Ling." Both the chamberlain and Tondon's wife could see that while the fulfillment of such a prophecy might be pleasing for Ling, it would certainly be a considerable disadvantage to Tondon, who would certainly lose much of his power and revenues. Angrily, Tondon ordered his horse saddled, then rode alone through the streets of Ling, causing many who saw him to reach for their beads and whisper a prayer. For the noble steward of Ling to ride unaccompanied did not augur well, especially when his face betrayed his terrible anger. He knew that his only chance was to act decisively and swiftly, without mercy to his enemy. Where is the child? Fear flooded through Gongmo as she heard the threatening voice from in the corridor outside her room. Desperately, she looked for some means of hiding her child, but there was no place, and she thought how they might escape. As she thought how they might escape, the door crashed open. Tondon stood in the doorway, his great body wrapped in a satin chuba, heaving with exertion. Behind him, his sister, the queen, stood looking nervous. Tondon, his fat hands outstretched, bore down on Gongmo as she backed away. I have seen the strange signs that show you have given birth to a demon, Tondon shouted. It is not true, Gongmo was weeping and cried out as she felt the unyielding wall behind her, leaving her helpless before Tondon. He tore the child from her. She flung herself at him, attacking him with all the force in her body and the crazed desperation of a mother defending her offspring. The queen screamed at the terrible blow Tondon gave Gongmo. It sent her sprawling into the corner, and she had to look away when he swung the baby high in the air and repeatedly smashed the child's body against the wall. Eventually, the queen could stand it no longer. Stop, she begged. Tondon, please, he must be dead by now. Tondon dropped the limp body onto the floor. His face was streaming with sweat. Vigorously, he splashed his head with water from the leather pail. Gongmo moaned with pain and grief. Suddenly, the queen grabbed her brother's arm. Tondon turned. Amala! Amala! The child was standing, grown to the size of a 2-year-old, gently stroking his mother's hair, and apparently completely unharmed by Tondon's brutal battering. Now, Tondon shouted at Gongmo, who drifted in and out of consciousness, say that this child is not a demon. He snatched a rope from a hook in the wall and grabbed the baby, deftly binding his hands and feet. The child caught Tondon's eye for a moment, and the steward found himself meeting the gaze of someone far older than a child of a year, let alone of a few hours. The child's eyes frightened Tondon with their challenging, mocking look. As he picked up the bound child, the little boy shouted to his mother, "Do not fear, Amala, have faith." But even as he spoke, Gongmo hurled herself at Tondon, scratching, kicking, and biting for her child. Tondon, frightened by the ferocity of the attack, yelled for his sister to help him, and struggled to keep his hold on the infant. The queen held Gongmo, enabling Tondon, his buck teeth working up and down as he puffed with exertion, to tear himself free and run with the child to the courtyard. He could not, dared not, look again into the baby's eyes, but he could feel them on him. Tondon ran, harder than he had ever run before, and hurled the infant into the household rubbish pit in the corner of the courtyard. "Devil child," Tondon shouted as though to convince himself as much as anybody else, and to drown out Gongmo's moaning, despairing cries. Using all the energy he had, Tondon manhandled an enormous millstone from where it had been leaning against the wall of the house to the edge of the pit. Tanden thought the exertion would kill him as he toppled the stone, so it fell and completely sealed the top of the rubbish pit. Tanden staggered and clutched his chest. He thought his heart was going to collapse. A few hours later, after he had rested, Tanden was mounting his horse in the courtyard and saw Gongmo lying on the millstone, distracted with grief, as she tried in vain to pull the stone from the pit. Tanden rode his horse out of the courtyard, keeping his eyes ahead toward the gate. The days passed without any word of the child. The queen sent her brother a message reassuring the steward that he had finally succeeded in destroying the infant. But Tonden's mind would not rest. It was haunted by thoughts of the child, by a dreadful fear that he still lived. No matter how often he tried to dismiss the doubts, he always ended by asking himself, how could any child have survived the battering he had given it? What child could almost walk and certainly talk only hours after birth? Would such a being really lie entombed, defeated beneath a millstone? He had to be sure. Trusting no one but his wife, Tongden sent her to the king's house to personally check the pit. Hearing of her arrival, the queen went down to the courtyard to greet her sister-in-law. The two women found it difficult to make themselves heard above the laughter of the servants who filled the yard as they watched a performance by a group of strolling players. See, the woman pointed at the great millstone lying across the mouth of the rubbish pit. It is undisturbed. The two women smiled at one another in relief, then stiffened, fear chilling at them, as the bubbling childish laughter behind them. They turned to find a small boy, about 4 years old, looking up at them both intently. Surely, Tonden's wife thought, this cannot be the child. It is ridiculous to even think such a thing. The child laughed gently, but knowingly, mockingly, then darted away among the crowd. Now the steward's wife knew the child lived. The queen had known the moment she looked again into the child's eyes, not the eyes of a child, but of generations. I'm going to leave it there. I couldn't stop until I knew he was okay. I sort of thought he would be okay, but now we know for sure. So we continue tomorrow. Gosh, this is an exciting story. See you tomorrow. Many blessings. Stay safe and happy.